Hey everybody, Jam Creates here. Happy Halloween. I'm on my way home from work, doing another car cast. Hopefully I can make it home and maybe catch some trick-or-treating action with my daughter when I get there. So today I want to talk about something. I have a thing in mind, so let's just get right into it. I want to talk about how comic book pros, but specifically comic book writers, seem to be falling into, at least the ones at Marvel, some of the ones at DC as well, they seem to be falling into a few different things. But I mean, one of them is the overt politicization, sticking politics into things where they don't really necessarily need to be. That word, politicization. Politicization, that's it. I knew I'd get there eventually. It was a little bit of a journey. But the other thing is it's not just that. That's not the only problem going on at some of the big publishers right now. One of the other things that's really an issue, at least to me, is writers not knowing how to write for the characters that they are being tasked with writing. So what that means is, if you're someone who is tasked to write, say, The Punisher, you shouldn't be writing a comic that's full of silly little jokes and cute little love stories and things like that. That just doesn't have any place in The Punisher. Let's be honest. That's not what that book is about. And what seems to be happening is the writers are falling into this problem of not being able. They're picking style. It's a problem that happens in sports a lot. It used to happen a lot more. At least I used to notice it more. I don't know if it's still happening as much. It does happen sometimes still, where a coach who is so in love with a system that they ignore the fact that their players that they have on their team don't fit that system. So, in other words, what you get is, maybe you've got a team that has a fantastic run-blocking offensive line, a really great running back, but a mediocre to, below average quarterback. And instead of running the ball and riding that stellar line and running back combination, they instead insist on throwing the ball 40 to 50 times a game. Why would you do that? Why are you going to run that type of offense if you don't have the personnel? If you don't have, let's say they have no wide receivers and a crappy quarterback, and they have a fantastic running game, but they insist on throwing the ball and not running because that's just the system that they like. Why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. A good coach would adapt their style of play calling and their style of offense to fit the personnel that they have. And that's the same thing a writer needs to do. You need to change your style of writing to fit the story, the character, what you're being tasked to write. So if you're being tasked to write Wolverine, maybe you shouldn't be someone who only writes Disney Channel humor and, romance stories or something like that. If that's all you know how to write, then you should not be writing Wolverine. Unless you can adapt and write an action-packed story, then that's fine. If you could do that, that's fine. But unless you can do that, that's not the book that you should be on. And this is where we're running into this same problem of system over personnel in two areas. First is really first would be the other way around, but whatever. The first is what I mentioned, is the writers. The writers not being adaptable to the characters they're being asked to write. If you don't know how to write action and adventure and that kind of thing, then you shouldn't be writing comic books. Let's be honest, you shouldn't be writing superhero comic books. You could certainly, if you can write humor, write a humor book. There's plenty of humor comics out there. Disney has a whole line of stuff based on their cartoons and stuff. I mean, there's tons of stuff you could do. And this is excluding the idea of you could just make up your own damn book and your own characters and do that way. That's just a given. And people just won't do that because there's too much risk involved in that. And you see the people who do that are taking a big risk, and sometimes it's rewarded and sometimes it falls flat on its face, and that's just how it is. But that's the risk you take when you launch your own book. But when you're working on someone else's property, you need to write the character as the character. So the other level of this same problem is at the management level, or I guess the editorial level of these companies. They are assigning writers to the wrong books. Don't assign, if you are the coach, use your personnel the way they should be, the way they best will shine. Put them in a position to succeed. I'm sorry, but if you're putting a writer who does not know how to write action adventure stories on superhero comics, well, that's your fault if the comics doesn't sell. Yeah, it's the writer's fault for not being adaptable to an extent, but in all honesty, it's even less the writer's fault and more the decision maker who put that person in charge to write that book. It's their fault. As a coach, your job is to put people in a position to succeed. It's not to just put somebody in there and hope they can do it. I mean, that's why you don't just get like some random guy out of the stands to play quarterback for your team or to play point guard or whatever sport you want to talk about. You don't just grab people out of the audience and do that, because that's not what they're meant to do. You need people in the correct position to succeed. You could have a fantastic quarterback, but if he's the only good player on your team, you're still not going to win. Because if his offensive line stinks, he's going to spend the whole game running for his life or getting knocked in the mouth. And that's the end of it. And there's just nothing good is going to come from that. So what you need to do is you need to figure out your personnel. You need to figure out where they belong and what they should be writing if you're in editorial. And if you are full of a bullpen of writers, if you have a full collection of writers and none of them know how to write action, if you're Marvel Comics, let's say, and you've got a full bullpen of writers that don't know how to write action adventure stories, well, then you screwed up when you were hiring these people. On what basis were you hiring them if they can't write action adventure stories? Why did you hire them in the first place? Again, I would not care less if you hired somebody who's really good at writing like teen romance. If you were launching a line of teen romance comics, then by all means, don't hire me to write that, because I'd be terrible at that. That's not at all where my interest lies. That's not at all where my skill set lies. Yeah, I could probably find a template to follow and do something, but it wouldn't be good. It wouldn't be exciting to the audience. It wouldn't be fun for the audience who was looking for those teen romance stories. It would just be by the numbers, blah, blah, blah. It just wouldn't be good. And that's where, if you can't find enough writers to write action adventure stories for Marvel Comics, what the heck are you doing? You're hiring the wrong people. And these people are not employees who come in and punch a clock every day and you can't get rid of them. They're all contracts. They're all contracted out people. They're work for hire people. You could just say, nope, not giving you this book. Moving on to the next person. But they keep refusing to do that. They keep refusing. They seem to think that whoever they plug into these spots is going to be able to do this. But the constant revolving door of writers and artists that keep just coming and going on every book, every 6 months it's a new creative team, that should tell you that you're not finding the right people. Because if you found the right people, those books would explode in popularity, and suddenly you would want those people to stay on that book for a nice long run like we used to have back in the day. That's just not happening anymore. And again, this is just mismanagement. It's mismanagement is what it is. A coach is essentially a manager of a business. The coach is hired to run a business. The business just happens to be a sport. It happens to be a team sport. And It's the same thing in business as it is in sports. You need to put your people in areas where they will succeed. You can't put somebody who is afraid to talk to customers and who is incredibly introverted and nervous and shut. You can't put them in a forward-facing sales position and expect to have great numbers as you would if you had a gregarious, outgoing, really talented salesperson in that spot. You just can't. You would not get the same numbers. It's just not going to happen. And it's the same thing with sports. If you put, if you run the wrong system for what your personnel is, you're not going to win. You're going to lose. It used to happen all the time. I used to remember seeing it happen constantly in the NFL. I saw it happen in basketball. I've seen it happen all over the place. Listen, most recently, I'm a New Yorker. I'm a Knicks fan. Do you think I enjoyed watching Phil Jackson try to force the triangle offense down the throat of New York Knicks fans? Like it was going to somehow be the savior for this terrible team? You know why the triangle offense worked? Because you had Michael Jordan, you had Scottie Pippen, and then later on at the Lakers, you had Shaquille O'Neal, and you had Kobe Bryant. You had transcendent players playing in that offense. The Knicks didn't have any of those guys. They didn't have anyone even close to those guys. So if you want to know why that didn't work, well, that's why it didn't work. You need to run a system that will work for the personnel that you do have. Don't be so in love with the system. Figure out what works for your players. If you've got a crappy offensive line in football, you don't run a ton of deep passing routes every down. You run short little dink and dunk passes and running plays to keep your quarterback from getting his head knocked in. And this is what seemingly the comic book industry has just never learned or forgotten, because they used to do this right, and it seems like they've just forgotten or don't care or whatever it is. And again, I'm not even talking about the subject matter so much of the books. Like, if you want to get into just the horrific plot details of, fighting the wage gap or nonsense like that, that's just no. But I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about the sheer fact that you've got people trying to write action adventure stories and superhero comic books who don't even like superheroes. They don't give a crap about superheroes. Very rarely is someone who doesn't care about a subject going to be able to handle that subject and put out something good. There's very few exceptions to that rule. And when it comes to superheroes, it's painfully obvious when people don't care about superhero comic books and they just turn out garbage. They just fit their words into people's mouths and it's just trash. It's just not good. Everything becomes silly. It's a joke. It's like I was talking about in yesterday's video about how everyone is a George McFly. There's never a big, I want to see, when I read a comic book, I want to see Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris at the end of Octagon fighting in the Coliseum. That's what I want to see. I want to see an epic encounter. I don't want to see George McFly one-punching Biff Tannen at the Fish Under the Sea dance, or whatever the heck it was called. That's not what I want to see. In Back to the Future, that's fine, because it's not an action movie. It's not about the fighting. It's about the story. It's about the comedy. But when you're doing comic books, it is about the fighting. It is about the action. And you need people who know that and who understand that and who can write that. I'm not saying these other writers don't deserve to work in comics. They absolutely can work in comics. I don't care. Anyone can work in comics if they can write good stories that make sense for what they're writing. So if you're going to write a story, you know what, honestly, if somebody decided they were going to write Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan, right? And they were going to turn it into, we're going to make this kind of like a teeny bopper, Archie Comics, little romance, high school drama kind of book or whatever, because she is a high school student, or at least she was. I don't know if she still is. If you told me you were going to turn that book into that, and you were going to put that kind of writer on that book, I would say go for it. That's fine. That's fine. First of all, nobody gives a rip about Ms. Marvel. And secondly, it might give that book a personality that people might enjoy. People might actually care about that book at that point. And it would be fine, because you're talking about a kiddie character in a world that you could do something else with. It's fine. But when you're talking about, Captain America, or Wolverine, or the Punisher, or Thor, or Iron Man, or any of these other characters, you need people who know how to write comics, and you need people who care about comics, and you also need people who care about the characters.